Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of today at the Eurasian Media Forum. And what better way to wrap up the discussion than with our environment topic and a session entitled Green Strategy, Another Last Chance. And moderating this session, having come over from his base in Belgium, is the Editor-in-Chief of the EU Observer. Please give a warm welcome to Kurt de Boeuf.
Thank you very much. And it's to attend this panel on Green Strategy, Another Last Chance. And it is my honor in the first place to introduce our panelists who are from an extraordinarily diverse background and who will tackle the issue we are going to discuss today from many different angles. Let me first ask to come to the stage Mr. Timur Jantikin, who is the CEO of the Kazakhstan nuclear power plants. He is advisor to the International Atomic Agency's Director General on Technical Cooperation, Nuclear Security, and Mr. Timur, I will use the first names, it's going to be easier, is from Kazakhstan. Please have a seat. Secondly, I would like to introduce Matthew Pye, who is Head of Philosophy at the European School Brussels II. There are 4 European schools, that's why 2. And he's founder of the Climate Academy and an author of a book called Plato Tackles Climate Change. He lives in Belgium. Thirdly, I would like to introduce Nazanin Alikia. She's a humanitarian, philanthropist, human rights activist, and education ambassador. And she's joining us, I believe, from the UK, or is it rather Qatar? UK, okay, welcome very much. And then we have Irina Zhukova, who is Regional Director Sustainability for Russia and Eastern Europe, for Philip Morris International, and she's joining us online from Russia. There are 2 other panelists who are trying to connect and be with us very soon. Let me just introduce them for the moment that they will join us indeed, which is Kadu Sibunya, who is Chief Executive Officer of the African Wildlife Foundation, and he will join us from Kenya, and also Joe Ruxton, who is the founder of Ocean Generation, formerly known as Plastics Ocean, from the UK, and hopefully he will be able to join us soon online from the UK as well. So our panel, again, is a vast subject. What is the green strategy? Can we preserve what we have? And can we preserve indeed our nature and give it through the next generations? I must say that this summer, again, was the warmest summer ever recorded. And when I was driving this summer from Belgium to France, I saw floods in Belgium, in Germany, while at the same time there were wildfires and record heat waves, not just in France, but also in North America, Southern Europe, Russia. There were typhoons going on several continents in this earth. And you ask the question when you see all of that, how can this continue? How can this go forward? And certainly, of course, what needs to be done? Let me ask you a first question, which is, from each point of view that you are working and thinking and trying to be an activist in some ways, is what is the worst case scenario from your field? I mean, how do you think if right now nothing is done, what would the world, from your perspective, look like in the years or decades to come? You can go to 2030 or 2050 as you like. Let's go first to Matthew Pye, actually. So what is your nightmare dream about what is going to happen?
Yeah, so in agreement with Nazin, I think the worst case scenario is happening now. I don't see how it can get worse for a Pacific nation. But if we talk about looking decades into the future, well, we seem to be on an unwavering path towards 3 to 4 degree warming. And that sounds like an abstract problem, but if we put that into a metaphor of the human body, if I had a temperature of 2 degrees, I would be struggling to think clearly now and be on this stage. And if I had a temperature of 4 degrees, medicine calls that hyperpyrexia, and I'd be just 1 day, 1 hour or 2 away from death. So if we have a planet that's on track towards 4 degrees, this is a problem which will, in the end, be universal, and these issues like the German floods and all these particular issues will affect everybody systemically. Now, I think as a philosopher, we have always to be attentive to data, and so therefore to kind of put just to ground all of this, we're in a situation now where the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are at 413, and that's not just a historic level, that's a profoundly historic level. The greenhouse gases have wavered in a stable equilibrium between 180 and 300 parts per million, and we just shunted them into a completely different gear. So if you're dealing with a planetary system with all kinds of chaotic forces, who knows how it's going to play out, but it won't look funny. So I think you can see already some of these things. We have a warming at the moment of 1.2 degrees, we're already at 1.2. And if you just think of the 3 basic elements of being a human being, food, water, shelter, sea level rises in the Mekong River, that's causing terrible problems of salination for rice. Water, the Himalayas, the projections on the glaciers are absolutely terrible, and over 2 billion people will suffer from that. And then just shelter, if you think of California and these parts, huge tracts of land will just become uninsurable. So we're right in the middle of something which is unfolding in an absolutely terrible pathway, and underneath it all, just to finish, our emissions are still accelerating.
Thank you. I mean, some would say that, if you look into history, that we have periods when the Earth was cooling down, the ice ages and so forth, and periods when the Earth was warming up. And there have been periods in the past that perhaps was less dramatic. What do you say to these people who are saying this?
Well, there are natural cycles in nature, the Milankovitch cycles, that depend on the tilt and the wobble of the Earth and so on. But you have to ask geologists, you can ask them about that. But like I said, if you look at the territory that we're in now, has not been seen in the readings of ice core data or anything for 4 million years. So that is very unprecedented. So yes, there are always oscillations in the climate, but this is not an oscillation. This is a shunt, and this is a very dramatic shunt. And we're in completely unknown territory. And there's no way you can account for this. Well, of course you can account for it. It's human beings and fossil fuels. It's not very difficult to work out.
Matthew, you already touched upon what needs to be done. Let me made the question a bit more concrete. So you said, if you have 1.5 degrees more as a temperature of your body, you start feeling very badly. And if it's more, you can't think properly anymore. So you're talking about the global warming, obviously, and about what should be done. But let's make it as concrete as possible. So in your opinion, what is the most urgent thing, perhaps concrete thing, that we should do in the years to come?
Yeah, I'm going to be modest and say it's not my opinion first. 1.5 degrees, as you say, is not comfortable, and we know that there's a budget for that, a carbon budget, and that's known by science, and it's known very clearly, and that's 233 gigatons. So we can still emit another 233 gigatons into the atmosphere and have a good chance of staying at 1.5. So that is what it all comes down to. There's all these different angles and perspectives, different initiatives, but at the end of the day, that's the budget. And I think that when you ask, what's the concrete solution? Well, it's not more complicated than that. Now, there are two, in terms of how do we achieve that, I think there are two major things to say. And the first is with media, and the second is with governments. If you think about media coverage of climate, it's extremely pervasive, and we have, all sorts of climate, especially after Greta. There's a big surge in climate coverage, but there is no coverage of a climate index. We don't have a carbon budget index. and by its emission, that's a really freaky fact. When you open The Economist, you have all the gold, all the oil prices, all the inflation rates, all the GDP rates, but we don't have a handle on that carbon budget. You go to COP. I was in COP 25 in Madrid. At no point is the carbon budget addressed or central to media coverage of anything. So nothing is ever measured according to just the hard truths of what it all adds up to. And I think that here we have many major media companies. That is something that I think they have to step up to. Now you say, well, I've lied a little bit in that there is actually an index. And this index has been worked out by the climate scientists that I work with, Birgit van Munster and Michael Wadley, and they're in close collaboration with the world's most eminent scientists. You can go on the website, Could 11%, and this website takes that index and it gives every single nation of the world what their fair responsibility is for that global 233 gigatons that are remaining. And if I just break that down a little bit, if you think that every year we emit 42 gigatons into the atmosphere, and if there are 233 left, that means we have 6 years before 1.5. Now, but when you match that with, as you mentioned before, Europe's targets for 2050 or targets for 2060 or whatever, those timescales are way off. And so in some ways we just need a reality check, and that's not happened. The media currently is not holding governments or corporations or anybody to account. So this carbon index should be out there. And in terms of our country, Belgium, if you look at the data for that, in order to stay under 2 degrees C, Belgium should cut its emissions by 14% per year, starting from today. That's for 2 degrees. And for 1.5, you can go and look it up on the website, because it's a shocking truth.
Right. Thank you. So we're discussing now already 1 hour. We have half an hour to go. So we had many perspectives. I mean, there's one question coming, but before I do, I would like to ask you one question that obviously everybody wants to know. Is like, I mean, you authored a book on Plato tackles climate change. Can you explain briefly what Plato has to do with climate change?
Yeah.
I mean, just very briefly.
That's a challenge, because Heidegger took 1 year to take the first sentence of Plato, so I'll be quicker than that. In the end, I conclude with the fact that individual actions are simply not enough. The type of scale of reform and infrastructure that's required can only happen through legislation. You need governments. Once you have the media making this number clear, then you need to have governments that can act on it, because all of our energy policies, everything is wired into the matrix of a legal system. And unless you set clear boundaries, if I just give one example, I heard Boris Johnson talk about the ambitious UK policy about climate change, but if I'm a teacher in a school, if we had an ambitious policy to reduce the number of poisonous pizzas in the canteen, I don't think ambitious is really a kind of a fitting adjective for that. So I think we have to get rid of the word ambitious and just, are we meeting the carbon budget or not? And so therefore, once you have the data in front of you, then you have a law to frame it. So laws simply, Messi can play wonderful football on a slightly smaller pitch, and it's the same. We need climate laws which bind nations to targets which are rooted in science and not rooted in general kind of waffly ambitions.
I think that's clearer than Plato himself, so thank you.
Well,
so one question from the audience.
The first online question is, many young, frustrated activists like Greta Thunberg place alarming statistics in front of governments and claim nothing is addressed. It is all talk.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, I think you can take quite a good example from Martin Luther King. If we think about Greta Thunberg, she certainly brought many people onto the streets. But what did Martin Luther King fight for? he fought for laws, and he wasn't satisfied. He was kind of intolerant of slightly, gestures towards a solution. He didn't stop until the Civil Rights Act was signed, because he knew that that was the thing, that was the matrix within which everything else would be sorted out. And I think that's what, now that the climate strikes are active, now that we have people on the street, now that awareness has been raised, we have to get to the next level. And the next level is a focused demand for science to guide policies. Otherwise, you're right, it can just feel like always saying the same thing, always, cut emissions, cut emissions. You have to give it a focus now, and time is short.
I believe there's another question. So.
Yes, another online question. What would be the worst scenario for humanity if we do not take action?
Matthew feels...
Well, I think the worst case scenario, like the really worst case, of course, is that you end up pushing the climate into these tipping points. And I don't think I would ever read a bedtime story to a child where we describe what 6 degrees looks like. But we may, if we allow ourselves to go over 1.5 and 2 degrees, then we're entering to that minefield, and that's the ultimate. I mean, that's completely inhospitable to humankind. So, yeah.
We have a question from a lady here in the public, but Matthew has perhaps another opinion.
No. I think in some ways these examples are good to hold, to help us imagine climate change. We should stare at that and think through that this is going to play out across all sea levels and everything. I mean, if you just go back 16,000 years, we built our whole civilization on the sea levels that we inherited from there. But there's 80 meters of sea level that can still happen. And that's kind of an unimaginable thing. So I think if we, in a way, meditate on things like the Owl Sea, it helps us focus the mind to think, yeah, things can be different. The status quo, it's not fixed.
Matthew, I mean, how do you change the world?
Yeah, I'm kind of used to being, in philosophy has a great tradition of making people feel uncomfortable, so if I've created a negative vibe, then I own it.
You're welcome.
But I can do inspiring as well. I think if you look at, just go back to Martin Luther King, and if you think about the situation during the Montgomery bus boycotts and etc., when Rosa Parks sat on the bus and refused to move, she said one thing in her head. She said she just had the word Emmett Till. Emmett Till. So Emmett Till was the young boy who was brutally murdered in the Deep South. And by having an open coffin at his funeral, that triggered a whole... So sometimes negative things do actually cause inspirational shifts. And just 9 years later, the Civil Rights Act was signed. So society is shiftable, and you can have paradigm shifts quickly. So that, we can be optimistic. If we're brave enough to look at it, that can sometimes trigger dramatic change. So more concretely, just for myself, I think that we have to get out of the paradigm of thinking about ourselves as simply consumers. So less meat, less this, less that. And we have to recognize that we're fuller people than that. We're social, we are civic, we have values, and if we could awaken that spirit, then you can see transformative change happening. And that's what I'm doing in my Climate Academy. The Climate Academy starts with knowledge, and then they move on to do civic engagement and social...
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you... What is the Climate Academy?
Okay. So, like Plato, you have an intense education. His was 50 years, but I have to be a bit more modest, so it's 2. And I house gifted and talented people in a school, in my school, and they go on to develop projects which have a big impact, both locally, but also with a global kind of universal reach as well, so that they can be multiplied. So they have to think systemically from the beginning. And that's the shift that has to happen. We have to get away from just thinking of ourselves as consumers and getting to think of ourselves as like the full human being. I think we've had our imaginations cropped by the media and by politics. But the good thing is, like with Microsoft, when an image is cropped, you can click and just drag it, and you can restore the full image. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. I mean, in general, in Indeed, we started with the worst case scenario, and I hope that you realize how inspiring your personal stories actually are, and how that will motivate people, I mean, perhaps not to call them to become more ambitious, but at least to do something, because it's possible. I think we have 3 more minutes. Maybe there's one more question from the public.
I have a question to our foreign speakers. I would like to learn how things are like in their countries, because in our country, recently we've seen a struggle between environmental activists and businessmen who want to, for example, big hotels and develop their businesses in some beautiful natural sites, untouched natural sites. So environmental people are getting very uptight. Who do you think is righteous in this argument? Do you think any compromise is possible? And in your country, if you had at all these kind of situations, how did you resolve them?
Can someone take, let's say, the foreign perspective very briefly? Matthew?
I think again, the Green Deal, all these Green Deals, they have to be seen as positive. You know, all of the things that we're fighting for, all these infrastructure changes and everything, it's kind of an unfair dichotomy to say that, you know, well, this kind of negative climate agenda, it's a chance to regenerate, to restore wildlife, to have healthier lives. So I think there's not a conflict, and I think that in the case of particular countries, as long as we have that perspective, I think that will help synthesize these opposing forces.
Okay, let me conclude. So just with one single question for each one of you, and you just have to answer with a number. From 1 to 10, how optimistic are you if it comes to the world, well, beating climate change? Matthew? Gonna say 10.
I'm gonna say 10 because it's.
So we ended with the cruelest disasters in the world facing climate change, and I think we ended with an overall optimism that it will happen, and that we will preserve our nature, and that we can give our children or grandchildren at least a bright future. Thank you so much, Timur. Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Nazanin. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Matthew, for this inspiring panel discussion. Thank you so much.
A very big thanks to Kurt and the panelists as well for that great discussion. I'm glad it ended so optimistically.